Welcome to the Holding All the Cards podcast. My name's Daniel. I go by Kiramode on the forums, and today I'm going to talk about potentially going between, fun decks versus competitive decks when you're going to a tournament. So this topic's particularly relevant right now because Worlds is coming up not that far from now. It's about a month and a half away. Now, a lot of people can't make it this year just because, it's too close to the last one, and negotiation with wives and or work can sometimes stop that. But a lot of people are going, and I think there's gonna be a lot of people that haven't gone before that are wrestling with the decision of do I run like my own creation, something that I love, something that I think is fun, or do I play something that I think will help me win more? And there's a couple ways to look at this, right? So there's some people who are of the mentality that I'd rather do well with a deck that I love than win with a deck that I don't. And then there's other people that want to win at all costs. I personally think everybody wants to win deep down. I think when people say that they'd rather do well with a deck that they love, what they're really saying is, I'm not sure that playing a competitive deck would put me that much closer to winning anyways, so if it's all the same or at least close to it, I'd rather just go with my stuff. I think that's what people really talk about when they say stuff like that. Everybody wants to win, but there is an element of people don't like to be boring. So I can 100% sympathize with people who, on Darkseid in particular, they don't want to play just mono navy. And on light side, they don't want to basically rip off Tom Malucci's Worlds deck that he won 2 years ago, and just like everyone else has done. Like I get that sentiment of you don't want to just steal someone else's creation. You want to build your own thing and do that. My thought on it is, if you're gonna go to a big tournament, you probably should play the best cards, and the reason is, nothing is worse in this game or really any other game. Nothing's worse than getting your ass whooped. It's just the worst. Like there is seriously nothing. Nothing is worse than just you have your decks, you love them, they're your creation. You have faith that they can do well for you. You're not necessarily thinking you're gonna win the tournament. You're not even necessarily hoping to make the cut or whatever. You just want to do well, and then you show up, and not only do you not make the cut or win the tournament, you just get completely mauled. Like you're losing just about every game, and the games you do win, you deep down know you should have lost, and it's one of the most deflating experiences you can have. So my opinion on this is that's what you want to avoid more than anything else. You just don't want to get smoked when the time comes. And I think the biggest reason why people get like demolished in this game unexpectedly is people just don't practice in this game. And the non-practicing part in this is, I think, largely due to the fact that we play an asymmetrical game, and on top of that, the games take a while. So, in a structured tournament, you're gonna have time limits. So you have 70 minutes per round, so you're only supposed to get a game out in 35 minutes. Although I've personally noticed that the less experienced a player is, the longer it takes for them to do a turn. And generally, the better you are, the quicker you can play. And I mean, that makes sense, right? Like when you're good at the game and you've played for a long time, you can just look at boards, and there's going to be, your opponent can have 6 units and you can have 6, and then there could be a couple enhancements, and it's sometimes all it takes is you just ask a question. You just say, like, for example, me, I'll look at them and I'll say, how many cards do you have in hand? And then they'll tell me, and then I'll just say, let me look at your discard pile real quick, and then I can just flip through the discard pile real quick and immediately make a decision as to whether or not I want to even attack that turn or how I'm going to attack. For me to make that decision, it generally takes me maybe 20 seconds to do that. But I've noticed with less experienced players, that's like a 5-minute decision. And the thing about that is, in a tournament, that's detrimental because it means you're more likely to go to time if both of your games are longer games. You're gonna go to time more often than not. So that, I mean, that's part of the benefit of playing fast. But it also, where I think it really hurts, is practice, because in a tournament, at least, if your games are dragging ass, they cut you off at some point. And like, to me, I think 70 minutes is a very generous amount of time that they give for tournaments. But when you play just like against your friends, right, or if like you're playing someone over Skype, or you're playing someone at some some card shop or something, what I've noticed is these games, oftentimes a game of Star Wars can bleed into over an hour, which is insane, but it happens to a lot of people. And what this creates a situation is that, between the fact that the game takes forever to play and that you're not playing each deck, players get virtually no practice. And I'll give an example of this. Let's say I'm playing, let's say I've already decided my decks, right? Like I already know which light side deck and which dark side deck I kind of want to play, or at least I have hopes to play these decks, but I haven't really like practiced them. It's just more like up here, I kind of like what they got. So let's say every day I practice. I practice for 3 hours, right? And let's give myself 1 week's time. So if I practice for 3 hours every day with just those two decks, right? Just the two decks. This is where my speed of play is huge in determining how much practice I actually get in those 3 hours. So if I consistently practice for 3 hours for 7 days, that's 15 hours of practice. The problem is, if each of my games take an hour to finish, that means I'm only getting 15 games, and only half of them are with a particular deck. And now, this is my opinion, but my opinion is, like, if you're trying to practice with a dark side deck or a light side deck, if you only have 8 games, that's nothing. Like that's like such a tiny sample size. Like, you have no idea what your draw consistencies are. You don't know what your matchups look like, because odds are, if you're playing it, you're not playing it against one specific deck, right? So if it was like, hey, I got to practice with this Navy deck that I created, and I know everyone's going to be on Spark decks, and so you run that deck against 8 different Spark decks, that's decent practice. That's like, okay, I now know how it does against Spark decks. But if in that practice time, it's like you play 2 Spark decks, 2 Owen decks, a Vehicle deck, 1 Kraken deck, a Hera leader deck, and then one of Josh Johnston's like crazy decks that he rolls out, you're not, I mean, you got variety, but you have no idea how good your deck is, because you need to get a deck to play each one of those decks multiple times to really see how it matches up. And I mean, I get it, right? Like, I get people don't have time to practice, like, and I think most people play once, maybe twice a week. If you're practicing for a tournament, maybe that goes up to 3 or 4 times per week. And in each of those days, you're probably only practicing like 3 hours. So if, let's say, you're going to Worlds now, and or like you're starting your training for Worlds right now. Worlds is a month and a half from now. So you have 6, maybe 7 weeks of time to practice. So let's be generous and say that you're able to get with any particular side, I don't know, let's say 5 games a week. So let's say with one particular side, like your dark side deck or your light side deck, you're able to get 5 games in per week with that deck. You only have like about 35 games to work with, maybe 42. But okay, so that's actually pretty decent for one side. So if you have your 30 to 40 games, you can learn exactly one deck in that time. You can reasonably learn one deck. What you can't do is learn multiple decks. And if there's something that I've seen with players, and it's not just Star Wars, but other games too, but definitely in ours, is that people will divvy up those 40 dark side games or 40 light side games, and they'll basically take like 6 or 7 different decks and just play each one of those decks like 4 times or something. And it's like, you don't really know if your deck's good at that point. So an example of this would be my good friend Bad Mojo Jojo. So I pre-Worlds this past year was practicing hardcore, and I was playing all the time, and I tried to play as many games as I could every single day, just practice. He's more of a wing it type of guy. Like he'll just like practice for maybe a couple times, 2 weeks ahead, and be good to go. Now he's a pretty good player, but he fell into this small sample size trap, which is, so pre-Worlds, he asked me, what should I play? And I told him, just play Navy. And he didn't want to play Navy for a couple reasons. A, it was a boring thing, and B, when we were playing, I feel like I can pick apart Navy pretty well, and all of my decks I build are designed to be able to handle Navy. So we start playtesting, and it's like every time he picks up the Navy cards, it's like if he doesn't get the monster flop, he just loses, right? So he just saw Navy lose too many times, right? Like it's like it's tough to take a deck, play it 6, 7, 8 times, see it lose, 5 or 6 times, and think, yeah, this is the deck. I'm gonna roll with this. So he just saw it lose too many times, and I told him, like, look, man, I get you're losing these games, but it's still the best deck that you can reasonably run. And so then what happens is he builds an incredibly high variance Sith deck. So Sith deck was 2 Palps, 2 of the GA Vaders, 2 Mara, 2 Sate Pestage, 2 Saris. Now, if that deck hits, it's borderline unstoppable, because if you can get like the turn 1 Mara plus a resource, and then all of a sudden it's lightnings and deadly sights and Sate bringing cards back, and Vader's objective is tapping down dudes, and then you got the Vader Mara targeted strike team going in and just killing everything. When that deck hits, it's phenomenal. But when it doesn't, like when you play a turn 1 Sate, when you play a turn 1 Saris, when you play turn 1 Chuds, or when you play like an Advisor as one of your 2 Chuds, that's when that deck goes from like phenomenal deck to just nosedive. And so we played a couple games. I would say we played 4, maybe 5 games in the entire time of testing. But here's the key: he won like all but one of those games, and in his wins, he actually beat the deck that I was running for Worlds. So it's like, you put yourself in his shoes. It's like, okay, I can run this deck, Navy, that I've seen it get its ass whooped way too many times, or I can run this other deck that I saw just beat my best friend's best deck and won all these other games. Guess I'm gonna roll with Sith. And I still told him to run Navy, and he's like, you're crazy. And here's the problem: he went to Worlds, and those great draws that he had against me in that small sample size didn't show up at Worlds, right? Like, he didn't have the great draws. So now all of a sudden his deck just tanks, and he's just getting steamrolled in these games, and he's just throwing up like a hissy fit, because it's like, yo, this deck sucks, and it's like World sucks and everything sucks, like, I mean, that's what happens, right? If you lose, everything starts sucking at that point, because there's nothing worse than just getting your ass whooped over and over and over again. And I think a lot of players fall into this. I think a lot of players, like, they don't think about how many games they actually play. I think what players will think is, they'll think, shit, I've been playing this one deck for like 8 straight hours. It's good, right? Because they can feel like people can feel how much time they spend playing decks, but they don't think about the actual sample size that they're working with, and that the sample sizes are incredibly small. I mean, to be frank, 30 to 40 games is still a really, really small sample size, but, relatively speaking, it's still way better than like 5 games. So this is why it's important to play competitive decks, or decks that are already competitive, like decks that are already established to be good. And it's that if you play Navy, or if you play one of the Spark decks, like you just net deck David Titi's Spark deck, or you play the creature deck, or you play one of the various scum decks that are on the forums. If you take a deck that is already established, while you yourself have not taken your 50, 60, 70, 80 reps with it that you should reasonably be taking to ensure that not only is the deck good, but that you can also play it efficiently, at the very least, the community as a whole has tested that deck for you, right? Like, you don't have to do all this testing to find out if your deck's good. You just have to do enough testing to learn how to play the deck. And this is where, like, I think a perfect example of this would be our world champion, Brad. So Brad is a phenomenal card player. He can, like, I think the dude could play any card game he touches. But the downside of being good at a bunch of card games is that you don't really focus on any particular one card game. So he can kind of, like, you know, right before a big tournament, just start practicing with the deck and then run with it. And so, like, in his case, he was given that deck list like the day before the tournament. And he says he wasn't fully prepared, but at the very least he was given like a for sure tier 1 great deck, and he already had some experience playing Navy. And most people do already have experience playing Navy, so it's like, I'm sure in the first like couple rounds of the tournament, he probably made some big mistakes. You know, like there were probably a couple turns I'm sure you wish you could take back. But make no mistake, like, he's a really good player. He already had some practice. He got some practice games in before the tournament. So by the time he got to the top cut, by the time that he played yours truly, he wasn't making mistakes. Like, he was on top of it and was able to play the deck optimally. Now, not everyone's as good as Brad, right? Like he's a really just talented card player. But what I'm trying to get at here is, you can get away with less practice if you already have a good deck, right? If you have a deck that's already proven to be good and all you have to do is learn it, that's much easier than taking a deck, having to figure out if it's good, and then having to learn how to play the deck. That's a much harder process, and especially if you're not going to devote a ton of time to that process, you need to stick with the competitive decks. Now, you can run your own stuff, right? So I think Colby's speeder deck is like a perfect example of like what happens when you can just get really creative and just throw a bunch of shit at the wall and see what sticks. And I mean, he played it really well, but make no mistake, the man practices a lot. So when you have time to practice like that, and also he's pretty efficient too, right? So like, his games tend to end quicker. So he's not spending an hour to figure out if his speeder deck can win. He's spending maybe like 15 minutes to find out. So like, when you're doing that, he's just able to get games in at probably 2 or 3 times as fast as your typical player, which just lets him learn if his deck's good and then also learn how to play it. So what I would say to you, if you're going to like some tournament that you actually care about winning, is I would say, like, if you want to build your own deck, that's fine, right? Like you can build something new and fun and creative. You just gotta practice. Like, that's the key thing. You have to practice, and like really practice. All right, not a couple games. All right, like don't think of practice in terms of time or weeks. Think of it more as like, how many games you play. You know, like just keep like a running tab in your head of like how many games you've actually played. So think about it, like, let's say you're playing a light side deck. If you have this light side deck you want to play, you should play that deck minimum 5 times against a Navy Fortress, minimum 5 times against a GA Vader deck, and minimum 5 times against a Scum deck that has what's his face, Dengar, because Captured's a really big card within Scum. Like, if you're not getting those games in, like don't kid yourself, man. Like, you can't like not practice against the top decks and then be surprised as to what happens later if you don't see things coming. So again, if you're able to practice, great. Like if you can put in that time and really learn a deck and really find out if it's good, against top competition, then run something crazy. But if you're putting in marginal amount of time, right? If whatever deck you're playing has very little testing time, you just run something good, right? Net deck something. Take like the deck lists in this game, they're everywhere. Like if you want to find a good deck, you can go online and you can find a good deck. But you gotta run something that's proven, something that like players know actually works, as opposed to running something that's off the wall, because the price to pay of running something that's crazy is that it might just faceplant. Now, there's another aspect to this too, which is also how big is a tournament. So, how important the prizes are will generally determine how much people care. So, for example, if you go to a store championship, people rarely care about the prizes in store championships, and they rarely care whether or not they win. Now, there's always going to be that one guy that cares. So, like, I'll go to a store championship. I'll generally play jank decks when I go to a store championship. And it's like, okay, so, yeah, I mean, I'll generally be competitive and win a lot of games against most players. And then there's going to be that one guy that cares a little bit too much, and he's going to kick my ass. But it's like, whatever. It's one game. Like, it's one game. I lose the tournament. I'm not tripping about it. But it becomes a problem if every player is that guy. And so, like, at Worlds and even some regionals, that's the case. Like, that's just everyone that's there is there to win. And everyone that's there is playing their best deck, and everyone there actually cares. So if that's the situation you're in, then you can't bust out the jank. You know, you have to actually bring the real decks. And again, don't take this video as me trying to discourage creativity, right? So I personally love getting creative with decks. I like trying to make new ideas, and I like trying to figure out if like new deck types can emerge. But to me, that's something that you do when you're testing. It's something that you do when you're having fun. But when it's actually time to play, when it's time to go to the tournament, whatever you play during that tournament, it needs to be top notch. It needs to be something that you're willing to go to war with, because I mean, otherwise you lose. You know, otherwise you'll just get your ass whooped by a whole bunch of players and want to just like drop out of the tournament. You know, and like, no one likes getting swept. No one likes going 1-3 in their first 2 rounds. Like it's just a bad feeling to have to deal with that. So best solution is just play good cards, you know. And again, you don't have to necessarily play Navy. You don't necessarily have to play a Spark deck. But what I would say is, if you don't 100% know what you're playing, just net deck something. And if you do want to play something a little different, what I would say is, especially right now, like if you have like a month and a half before the big tournament, just if you know you want to play a certain deck or a certain deck type, just pick the deck and just practice the hell out of it. Like just practice. Maybe you swap one pod here, one pod there, but just keep burning through them. You know, because then when the time comes, even if your deck isn't the best deck, it would be yours, but you will also know how to play it. And that's very, very important, to be able to just play your own deck. And I mean, if you're more into it, right, if you want to go a step beyond that, the best way to absolute test everything is to test everything, right? Ideally, we all as players would be able to take every single deck type, run them against every single possible foe, give each deck a good opportunity to see whether or not they can do something, and then after you've tested everything, you pick whichever deck best fits your playstyle. Unfortunately, practically, we can't do that. So, because you don't have that luxury, and because most people, they need time, and that's time that they don't have, just net deck. You know, pick something that's already good and run with that. And again, if you want to be creative, just practice. And if you can't practice, well, you know, take Tom's decks. So yeah, hope this helps people that are, you know, testing for whatever big tournament you have. I know a lot of people don't agree with me on this kind of stuff, but I think it's good. I think it'll help in the long run if you actually just get in that habit of like really going in and have the mentality that you're trying to win. It'll help you there, and it'll also help you with your testing too. And it'll help you with your fun games, like just knowing what's good, what's not, because it's like if you save the good decks for tournaments, that means you could play the jank, you know, everywhere else, and it's fine. So yeah, this has been an episode of Holding All the Cards. Hope you enjoyed.